Electric Friends, a Gary Numan podcast, celebrating the tracks by a musical pioneer.
In early 1979, Gary Numan would probably not have believed you if you travelled back in time and told him that by the end of the year, he'd be arguably the biggest pop star in the UK. In just a few months, he'd be one of the most famous singers in the country, with hordes of young fans following his every move, eager to hear what he would bring out next as the 80s came into view. This would have been a far cry for Gary for how he felt as an individual in early 1979. At this point, his band Tubeway Army had dabbled in punk rock with minimal success. Gary had often felt lonely growing up and into his teens and early 20s, and it would be a long time before he would be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which would help explain to him some of his personality traits that made him struggle with certain social norms. And so he channeled these thoughts and feelings into his music and writing. For Tubeway Army's next album, Replicas, Gary used a combination of his personal feelings and his own sci-fi stories to create what would be a turning point in electronic music. And the album kicked off with an explosion of new wave punk synthpop brilliance that perfectly showcased his sound, and it must have made listeners sit upright with a jolt when they first heard it. So for this episode of Electric Friends, we'll look back at the first track on Replicas, Me, I Disconnect From You. The track starts off with a solo synth lulling you in before Jess Lydiard's drums and Paul Gardner's bass joins, creating a jaunty, if hypnotic sound. By the time Gary's voice kicks in, the album begins with one of the greatest opening lines in Gary's history. The alarm rang for days, you could tell from conversations. I was waiting by the screen, I couldn't recognise my photograph. Me, I disconnect from you.
The alarm rang for days, you could tell from conversations. I was waiting by the screen, I couldn't recognise my photograph. Me, I disconnect from you. I was walking up the stairs, something moved in silence. I could feel his mind decaying, only inches away from me, and I disconnect from you.
With lines like Please Don't Turn Me Off and Me and a telephone that never rings, it conjures up images of one of Gary's sci-fi robotic characters. It sounds like one of the androids we hear about later in the album on Our Friends Electric. But it's also a way for Gary to explain his own feelings through the guise of sci-fi. Writing in his Praying to the Aliens book, Gary said, the lyrics on the Replicas album are still quite personal in a few places, but they are mainly science fiction based. It's often been said that I'm a tech-head sci-fi fan who writes doomy songs about spaceships, robots and aliens, but Replicas was my only fully fledged sci-fi album. Most of the songs are linked and are about the degeneration of humanity, the isolation of the individual, and I put myself into them, lots of I and me, so that I could place my own young, alienated feelings amongst the more storyline-based sci-fi stuff. Those feelings are absorbed into the general theme behind the album, which lyrically was loosely converted from a collection of short, connected stories I had been writing off and on about a future city scenario.
Please don't turn me off, I don't know what I'm doing outside. Me and the telephone that never rings. If you and me, what would you do? Me, I disconnect from you.
So you could say that Me I Disconnect From You is about the themes of isolation and disconnection. The lyrics, in a way, were far ahead of its time in that it kind of describes the feeling a lot of us probably have when dealing with the aspects of social media and the internet, a sense of detachment from the outside world. Replicas was recorded in late 1978 at Gooseberry Studios, London, and completed in February 79 with overdubs and remixing at Marcus Music Studios. Explaining about the process in Revolution, Gary said,
Beggars also allowed me to rent a mini Moog for a few hours each day for 4 of the 5 days we had booked in the studio. With an entire album to record in just a few days, and with the limited availability of the Moog, I had precious little time to experiment. I had to find workable sounds as well as layers of additional melodies as quickly as possible. It was fun, but it added a noticeable amount of pressure. Not least because I still had only a vague idea what the various dials and switches on the synths did. I essentially twiddled things randomly until the Moog made a sound I liked, and that could work for the part of the song we were working on. Once I had the sound, I'd quickly record that part on the first take if at all possible, and then move straight on to the next sound or section. Sometimes, if a mistake was made but it wasn't too glaring, we had to leave it. We just didn't have the time to get everything perfect. It was all quite amateurish, I suppose, but it felt exciting and adventurous to me, and I was in my element. I was learning about studio techniques, about the equipment, about mixing, about so many things. Martin Mills and Nick Austin came to the studio often and heard for the first time the new batch of songs I'd written. Songs like Me I Disconnect From You, Down in the Park, Praying to the Aliens and Our Friends Electric. Everyone seemed very happy with the way Replicas was coming together. It was certainly a clear progression from the first album, even though it was only a few weeks since Tubeway Army had been released. I was writing so prolifically that songs were pouring out of me, and Beggars allowed us back into the studio for another session, so I was able to record a few more. Added to the original session, we now had enough songs for a full album and several B-sides.
So prolific, in fact, that in just a few months he was on to The Pleasure Principle and Cars. Me I Disconnect From You wasn't released as a single, but you wonder what could have been. It's a perfect choice for a single. It's incredibly catchy, not too long, and it would have worked really well on the radio at the time. It had bona fide hit written all over it. But despite this, it has remained a favourite among Numan fans, and it is often performed live, and it's often the first track of the night, even to this day. It's his 7th most performed song of all time, and it's actually a great track to compare over the years of how Gary has changed over time.
In a long rank for days, you could have a conversation. I was waiting by the screen, I couldn't recognize my photograph. Me, I disconnect from you.
In later versions of Replicas, they included the early version of the track recorded as a demo before Replicas began recording fully. It's not a million miles away from the final version with a few tweaks here and there. And then there was also the version recorded for John Peel for his sessions just before Tubeway Army exploded. You've got to love the beep boop nature of the live recording. In 2003, Gary reworked the track for his hybrid remix album alongside Alan Moulder, who has worked with everyone from Korn to Nine Inch Nails to Depeche Mode.
I was walking up the stairs, something moved in silence. I could feel his mind decaying, only inches away from me. And I disconnect from you.
And the song provided one of the greatest cover versions of any Gary Numan song, none other than Grace Jones, who recorded an inspired reggae cover during her nightclubbing sessions. Sadly, it didn't make the album, but it was finally released on deluxe editions in 2014, and Gary later said he was very flattered that she had covered one of his songs.
The alarm rang for days. You could tell by conversation. I was waiting by the screen. Couldn't recognize my photograph. Me, I disconnect from you. I was walking up the stairs. Something moved in the silence. I could feel his mind decay, only inches away from me. I disconnect from you.
So just looking at your comments about Me I Disconnect From You on Facebook, Walt Wright said, the first Gary Numan song I heard was Cars and loved it enough to buy The Pleasure Principle, and shortly afterwards I was on vacation with my parents visiting an aunt in Canada when I happened to see the Replicas album that I'd never even heard of. My parents bought it for me and I listened to nothing else for a week. It's still my favourite Numan album, along with Intruder, but for some reason Me I Disconnect From You particularly resonated with my younger self. I remember thinking that the song's title made me realise, even so young, that I was under no obligation to tolerate toxic people in my life. Ian Fryer said, a brilliant opener for live sets and a real statement of intent for the Replicas album, one of my absolute favourite Numan lyrics, blurring the distinction between human and machine and using science fiction trappings to address themes of alienation, literally the inability to connect, and loneliness. Need I add that it's also a sing-along stomper. Rachel Shusky said, I honestly just remember being in awe when I first heard it. This was around 2010. I was slowly looking for more Numan besides Cars, so glad that I decided to see if there was more to him besides that while in college. Frederick Kielberg said, great opening track, fantastic lyrics. The melody has been spinning in my head since I first heard it, and the last lines describe my life and my feelings and my relations to my friends perfectly when I was about 20 years old. Neil Grimbleby said, it's probably one of the few tracks that I put on repeat when I listen to it. From that simple synth riff at the beginning, which then explodes into a bass-driven rock opening, it's just a perfect mix. And then you hear that opening line of Gary's vocal, and wow. Ian Charles said, absolutely Numan's best album opener, cracking track, still sounds stunning in today's live sets, and will be in my top 5 Numan tunes. I first heard it when I got my copy of Replicas and Christmas '79, still have it, and it sent shivers down my spine, still associate it with those great days. And on Twitter, Paul Hunson said, timeless track, I often wonder if Me I Disconnect From You had been released straight off the back of Our Friends Electric, it would have been massive as well. Loved hearing it live so many times over the years. Paul Anthony Fleming said, bought Replicas in our price Shepherd's Bush. It was a play of the week, so it was on the full shop music system. Me I Disconnect From You leads you into the dystopian world imagined by Gary, full of mistrust and paranoia and grey-dressed strangers who followed you with sinister intent. Fantastic album. Gary Hibbs said, Replicas will always be a track that makes me well up. I was a member of Sacrifice Yahoo group. Greg, who ran it, was a very close friend. It was our favourite track and I miss him every day. And finally, Tony J said, what a track. Gary Numan told me at a meet and greet that little brother John came up with the riff at Space Ward when he was like 12 years old. Brilliant. Fantastic belter of a live tune. Thanks for that. So yeah, thanks very much for all of those great responses, and thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to get in touch, then follow me on socials at Numan Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, or X of course, Instagram, TikTok and YouTube. Keep an eye out, and between each episode I put out call outs for you to send me your thoughts and memories about the next song choice, so please do follow and head to newmanpodcast.com for all previous episodes and subscribe away. You can also email me at newmanpodcast@gmail.com. So thanks again, I'll be back next time, and bye for now.
Electric Friends, a Gary Numan podcast celebrating the tracks by a musical pioneer.